Welcome to another episode of my weekly podcast, Later That Same Life. I'm Larry Fedoruk, and week to week, stories from our lives.
Season 4, Chapter 3.
This is Smokey and the Bandits.
Smokey versus the Bandits. Smokey versus the Bandits. To get a Class A truck driver's license in this country, and it may vary slightly by jurisdiction, requires 103.5 mandatory hours of training. If you take an average 8-hour workday and put your nose to the grindstone, you could be a truck driver in under 2 weeks. None of the training involves classes or necessary passing grades in the fields of science, medicine, philosophy, sociology, or politics. I love truckers. You are often underappreciated, and your role in our day-to-day lives generally undervalued. We certainly learned a lot more during recent reports about the global supply chain. I'm sure many truckers feel they are not adequately compensated. So do about 90% of the working population. We'd all like a raise. Most truck drivers, at least on this continent, are white, male, and middle-aged. And the most common degree of education is a high school diploma, although technically one is not required to obtain the truck license. I am not a pseudo-intellectual liberal elite talking down to the hard-working everyman. Your level of education and subsequent political bent does not make you better than the next person. Deeds, actions, and how you treat others is what defines us. I try to work that way. By and large, society does not. Society says that doctors, lawyers, teachers, and executives are not receptionists, janitors, cashiers, and truck drivers. If you get my drift. At the ballot box, everyone gets an equal say. That's great, but that's one day every few years. The rest of the time, many people feel it's hard to be heard. There were truck drivers involved in the protest in Ottawa. Obviously, trucks were parked. Somebody had to drive them there. But we were wrong to call this a truckers' protest. Maybe it started out as one, but it was quickly co-opted by right-wing extremists bent on anarchy. Real truckers were not in Ottawa parking near Parliament. Real truckers were unloading goods at my grocery store and at your pharmacy. Real truckers crisscrossed the world's richest international border, ensuring that people have the raw materials in order to keep their jobs and feed their families. Truckers are on the road every day working. They were not parked at the nation's capital. Those were anarchists. There were those border blockades, most famously the Ambassador Bridge, but those largely ended peacefully under initiatives from local police. Also, this was never a freedom convoy. Only the organizers call it that, I believe. Every other thinking person realizes this was not a convoy, it was an occupation. And freedom? Well, was it ever about freedom? I have not seen or heard one Ottawa protesting anarchist who seems to understand the meaning of the word freedom. Not only have they misdefined it, but they are misinforming anybody who will listen that this is what freedom looks like. I don't want to repeat my entire podcast about social contracts, but quickly, with rights come responsibilities. With freedom comes obligation. Social contracts, such as our Bill of Rights and our laws and statutes, say we give up a little freedom for greater security. We live free, and no one small special interest group can control the narrative for the majority. A small group of activists, some of whom may be truckers, under the false banner of freedom, have taken away the freedoms of many Ottawa citizens. Many cannot go to their jobs, run their businesses, or even enjoy their time in their homes because of the noise, the fumes, and displays of public drunkenness. And personally speaking, this protest has taken away my freedom to be condescending toward idiot Americans. Oh, it seems we've got the idiots too. Idiocy doesn't recognize borders, doesn't need a passport to travel. This is not a convoy, and it's not about freedom. Also, there were never 50,000 trucks descending on Ottawa. That ridiculous, unresearched number was at first very widely stated, even by the American media. Meanwhile, if you took all of the protests from different parts of Canada and added them up, it still wouldn't get anywhere near 50,000. I was amazed at how few even thought of that in the beginning. 50,000, wow, that's amazing. 50,000 would be about 40% of all of Canada's salaried truck drivers. 40% were off the road and at a protest. Not even close. Do you know how many trucks were parked in Ottawa at the peak? 400. That is a significant number, but it's not 50,000. And 400 is what percentage of salaried truck drivers in Canada? 0.3. 1/3 of 1%. And that's if those are really truckers. It was this tiny percentage of people who started crying about vaccine mandates, and then freedom, and then overthrowing the government. And some of the stalwarts saying they would not leave until all of their demands are met. Here's an historical note by observation. Anyone who has ever demanded all or nothing usually ends up with nothing. All or nothing is not even a starting point in negotiations. It's an insane demand that will never be met. All or nothing is just another factor that makes this whole thing so absurd. Speaking of absurd, the coverage of this protest, especially the Ottawa one, leaves much to be desired. Oh, sure, it's a big story, a lead story. But the wall-to-wall coverage, is that actually necessary? Well, it's not. But 24-hour news channels need content. So they are fond of beating a story to death. I guess I could just not watch. But why should I have to cut myself off from information just because I've had enough of one story? When you watch the footage of the protest, it's often all shot up close and low, so that the trucks look massive and ominous and threatening. The crowds seem huge and active and determined. Again, this occupation is not insignificant, but the angles they use to cover it makes it look bigger than it is. There's this one guy on CNN, Brian Stelter. He's a media reporter, has a show on Sundays called Reliable Sources, where he often takes apart things like news coverage. His line was, zoom out. And he zoomed out of an Ottawa shot. Big picture, if you will. You know what? The crowd and the protest suddenly looked a lot smaller in relation to everything else. It's called perspective. Why doesn't news show you that? Because there's no excitement in that. There's no drama. And how can they sell you the news without drama? The coverage, and I'm still on the fence as to whether this is intentional or agenda-driven, the coverage itself gives credence to the importance of the protest, when really maybe it's not that important at all. It's a small group of people causing a nuisance for another small group of people. Since when is that of national and international concern? The border blockades affected thousands of people with a significant economic impact, more so than a bunch of a-holes in Ottawa. Yet somehow they got more of the coverage. I guess because that was the national embarrassment. Capital City. Protesters took over. Hot tubs, bouncy castles, barbecues, porta potties. A DJ came in every weekend to host the street party. The national embarrassment. As I've said before, the news itself has to take some responsibility for their role in these events. The observer effect. Observing an event necessarily changes it. I'm not saying don't report on it, but the story. Let's first go to this reporter, and then to this other reporter. Here's one more reporter standing across the street. Now this police official, then this politician. Oh, breaking news, back to this reporter. Here's one of the protest organizers. There's his video from Facebook. Here's what people are saying on Twitter. And it goes on and on. Oh my God. It doesn't end. I was watching CNN after the Ambassador Bridge reopened, and he said, looks like things are getting back to normal here, but not with all the other protests all over Canada. The thing is, there was a protest going on in BC and Alberta, and of course Ottawa, but he didn't say that, did he? No. He said all over Canada. So anybody watching would go, hey, those protests are happening all over Canada. They were not. Just some small protests, those co-opted occupations that may or may not involve trucks and truckers. Here's a couple of quick points. About half of the millions raised through crowdfunding to support the protesters has come from outside of Canada, and most of that from the United States. And this is not, I'm going to wire some money to my cousin in Canada because he's involved in this protest thing. This is money coming in from unrelated organizations looking to disrupt free democracy to their own agendas. At the protest in Alberta, RCMP seized assault weapons, ammo, body armor, and a machete. You always have to throw in a machete, just to emphasize the crazy factor, and uncovered a plot where protesters were planning to assassinate police officers. Now, I'll give credit to one of the Alberta organizers who said, that's not us. We knew we'd been infiltrated, but we didn't know how to find out who these people were and how to get them out. We are here on a peaceful protest. Okay, small credit for saying that, but those are the kinds of things that are happening. The so-called head of the Ottawa protest has been associated with white nationalists and has made racist and anti-Islamic remarks. He's a middle-aged white male, which doesn't make you racist, but his remarks do. So when he says this is about freedom to do what? Hate? Within the first few days of the Ottawa occupation, protesters desecrated the tomb of the unknown soldier, the Terry Fox statue, shut down a local mall, and overran a soup kitchen demanding food that was meant for the homeless. Is that the freedom they want? One of the things our Emergencies Act can do is shut down the funding. Another thing it can do is bring out the army. I don't think you'll ever see that happen in Canada. As much as I may disagree with the premise of the Ottawa occupation, I'm also glad that I live in a country where we don't automatically send in the National Guard. Well, we don't actually have a National Guard, but you know what I mean. The United States does. A paramilitary organization under the watch of the U.S. military and under the command of the U.S. President and state governors. In this country, no politician wants that image on TV. or forever associated with this protest. Right? Canadian soldiers at the behest of the Canadian government battling other Canadians on the streets of Canada? For all intent and purposes, that's a civil war. The U.S. does it all the time. They have had dozens of mini civil wars. That is their style, not ours. I do take some comfort in that. The Ottawa protest went on so long for two main reasons. One, the complete failure of the Ottawa police when this got started, including an incompetent chief who mishandled the initiative from the get-go, combined with a disorganized civic government whose infighting delayed proper action. Secondly, the complete absence of the Doug Ford government in Ontario and a fearful Conservative premier who is weeks away from an election and didn't want to take the chance of offending his Conservative base. Ottawa is the nation's capital, but it's a provincial jurisdiction, and the province of Ontario provided too little, too late. Incidentally, about 100 of the 400 trucks in Ottawa had kids living in them with their guardians. The children are used as a shield. Even if the police decided they should use tear gas or rubber bullets or even fire hoses, they couldn't. There's kids there. What kind of person yells freedom and then hides behind their own kids? That's another thing the Emergency Act does. It makes it illegal to bring your kids to this demonstration. It's not about freedom, and it's not a convoy. It was an occupation. To think, it allegedly started out to be about vaccines. Wow. During these kinds of right-wing demonstrations, these insurrections, it is Canada's January 6th, there is always this argument that the left protests are treated differently than the right-wing protests. Well, the so-called left protests are usually against things like 300 years of oppression based on skin color, or centuries of colonization by the invading hordes, or an end to injustice, poverty, and inequality. This right-wing Ottawa protest, I don't want to wear a mask, I don't want to get a needle, I don't want to get a vaccine that actually might help save the lives of everyone I come in contact with. Never mind hundreds of years of oppression. These people couldn't last 6 more weeks under COVID mandates. Yeah, we're tired of them. Bulletin, we are all fatigued by this. We're all trying to just hang on a few more weeks, and maybe a few weeks more, because that is looking out for each other, so that we can all walk out of this thing alive. Nope, too much for you. I'm parking my truck in Ottawa. Every politician and person of authority, almost to a person, have made a point of saying that they believe in a Canadian's right to protest. By definition, a protest is going to be disruptive. It's going to be inconvenient for some people, because that gets attention. It wouldn't be much of a protest without those things. But even during Occupy Wall Street, they occupied a bunch of parks nearby, and they didn't shut down the economy while making their point. As much as we, as Canadians, may personally support the right to protest, this is no longer just a protest. Stop being one very quickly. It was an occupation, an insurrection, an insurgence, and a mutiny against our values. 0.3% of all the truckers in Canada do not represent their industry and should not represent how we feel about freedom or how we feel about truckers, for that matter. Any real truckers that may have been involved in the protest, you probably think that you're big rig is a complicated, expensive piece of machinery. And maybe your special skill set should come with some unique privileges. Yeah, well, try steering a nation around for a while. There's a lot of moving parts. You gotta fire on all cylinders just to move forward even a little bit. Driving conditions less than ideal. You are hauling a valuable payload. And, well, I don't want to take this analogy too far because you get it. Or do you?
Later That Same Life is written, produced, and voiced by Larry Fedoruk. Larry Fedoruk, 37 @gmail.com.